Konstantin Kisin, a comedian, a journalist, a commentator as well, someone who's very thoughtful on a number of issues. Why did you decide to write a book entitled An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West?
Someone should. That's how I felt. I felt someone should write a book about that because no one else is going to. You see the sort of thing that is rewarded now in our societies. The more time you spend talking it down, talking about how evil it was 500 years ago and whatever, the more rewarded you are for that. And I really wasn't that interested in having that conversation from that angle because first of all, I think it's been done to death at this point, but also I think it needs a challenge. It needs balancing out that narrative about this country or the West more broadly. I don't think represents the reality of where we are. I think if we're objective about it, we have to admit that we live in one of the best places not just in the world today, but in the entire history of the human species.
I'm interested in your background because, of course, you come from one of these countries originally where they had to put up walls to stop people from leaving. Whereas in the West, there's a lot of contention about people putting up walls and barriers to stop people coming in. It seems like there's a big distinction there between the sort of societies that people try and escape from and those people risk their lives to get towards. Can you tell us a bit about your childhood?
You put your finger on a very interesting conundrum, didn't you? Because we're constantly told that we live in this deeply racist society, and yet people who are black and brown are desperate to get here. There's something off about that, it seems to me. But in terms of my background, I was born in the late Soviet Union.
In the book, you talk a bit about your grandparents as well. Your grandfather, who was essentially forced out of any jobs for expressing an opinion. Your grandmother, who was in a gulag. Can you speak to that?
She was born in a gulag. She lives in Bristol. You can go and talk to her. She's alive today. So that's why I feel like our memories have become very short and very geographically limited too. We sort of forget about a world that existed only a blink ago. And my grandmother was born in a gulag because both her parents, who were not together at the time, they'd been sent there for various, crimes of various kinds, of saying the wrong thing, being from the wrong background, whatever. And they met there. My grandmother's mother ended up in the gulag because her husband had been taken away, and she went to inquire after him, and they were, oh, you're here, great, let's put you in the camp. With that sort of family background, I have something to compare the terrible, evil West to, and it doesn't seem quite as bad to me.
You do draw on some potential broader comparisons, perhaps not going as far as to say that we're going down a road to serfdom, but potentially taking some backward steps.
I don't think we're going to get to the gulag side of things, but I do think we are replicating some of the things that we saw in the Soviet Union when it comes to things like policing of people's thoughts, policing of people's speech. Most people in the West have no idea where political correctness comes from, but actually it was invented in the Soviet Union, later adopted by Maoists in China. And the point of political correctness was never to protect people's feelings, to make sure that minorities weren't offended or whatever we think of as now. The point of political correctness was to say, well, what you're saying, Tom, may be true, but it is not convenient to the party line, and therefore you must keep quiet. So we're definitely not going to the gulags, but on the other hand, we are spending an inordinate amount of time trying to control what other people think and say. And, I think one of the great triumphs of the West is creating a culture in which people are relatively free to express themselves. And that feeds into the science, the technology that we are able to create because we're able to experiment, to play with things, to play with ideas. So I think people who are paying attention and people who understand history ought to be very, very worried and concerned.
I wonder, to what extent do you think we are going down this path irreversibly, and what could be done to put us back on that road to a freer society?
That's a really good question, Tom. As you know, I put a bunch of ways of destroying the West but the one that I feel most strongly about is the last one, where I talk about how all of us have a duty not to be a useful idiot. This is a term that Lenin came up with to describe people in the West who could be persuaded to go along with supporting what the communists were doing in Russia and later the Soviet Union. And I think that's really the biggest difficulty that we have. Too many of us have been unwilling to stand up and say, actually, no, I don't support this. Actually, no, I'm not going along with this. Too many of us have accepted that in order to look good or to not be fired from our workplaces or not to be offensive to anyone, we must go along with things that actually deep down we know are wrong. Look at the grooming gang situation, covered up for decades, people unwilling to confront difficult issues, not because they didn't know right from wrong, but because they were worried about the racial sensitivities and whatever. We've got to, if we want to have a healthy multi-ethnic society, which is, I hope, what we have, we got to be able to talk about all of these things. So we got to all stop pretending to not know what we know and not to believe what we believe.
Why does it take a comedian to write this book?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to pretend that I'm the only person who's been speaking up about these issues. All the people that do end up being called names and they're bigots and racist and xenophobes, which kind of explains why few people want to get involved in it. I felt that I had the duty, not only as someone who's a social commentator, but also, you know, it's called an immigrant's love letter to the West. And unfortunately, that is the shield that you now have to be able to talk about these issues. You've got to, well, look, I'm obviously not racist, but here's some points. I wish we got to a position where people who look like you and people who look like me and people who look like every other skin color could say what they have to say without people instantly trying to destroy their lives and call them names. I think we should be able to have a sensible discussion about many of these issues, particularly when, you know, it's not like I've written a book that sort of champions something evil. I'm just saying what we have here is quite good. The fact that people might be concerned about writing a book like that, I think, tells you quite a lot about where we are as a society.
Why is, well, finally, in this conversation, the book is, of course, titled An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. You've mentioned that this is a bit of an homage to another book that was written, or another paper that was written not so long ago.
Yeah, Yuri Bezmenov, who I really recommend people go and find online. He wrote a book called A Love Letter to America. And he was making many of the same warnings. Thankfully, many of the warnings the predictions that he made didn't quite come to fruition. We've got to remember who we are. And the problem I have with the direction of travel we have in the West is we are starting to forget that for all our faults, we actually have some pretty good things here that are worth standing up for, that are worth defending, and that, by the way, stand up to scrutiny. They stand up to what the Russian government might say about us, to what the Chinese government might say about us. We have things that are worth protecting, that are worth sharing with the rest of the world. And the reason we started this conversation with the idea that many, many people around the world want to come here pretty much makes that point. So the most important thing is when people attack us, they attack our values, we say, no, we're not the worst people that have ever lived. We're actually quite good, and we believe in our values, that we believe that they're good for us, we believe that they're good for other people who want to be like us, and we're going to support them with that, and we're going to be confident in ourselves.
Konstantin Kisin, thank you.